Imagine waking up tomorrow to find your neighbor's house completely silent. No movement, no sound. You knock on the door, nothing. You peek through the window and see bodies on the floor. You rush to the next house. Same thing, and the next, and the next. Within a week, half your street is dead. Within a month, half your city is gone. Within a year, half of everyone you've ever known has been erased from existence. This isn't a horror movie. This isn't fiction. This actually happened. And it happened so fast, so completely, that people genuinely believed they were witnessing the end of the world. Today, we're diving into the single deadliest event in human history, the Black Death. A plague so devastating that it killed up to 200 million people and changed civilization forever. But here's what's truly terrifying. It started with just one flea bite. Let's go back to where it all began. Before we talk about death, we need to understand what was lost. Because the world of the early 1300s wasn't some dark, backwards place waiting to collapse. It was thriving. Europe in the early 14th century was experiencing what historians call the High Middle Ages, and it was incredible. The population had nearly doubled in just 2 centuries. Cities like Paris, Venice, Florence, and London were exploding past their ancient walls. Massive Gothic cathedrals were rising into the sky, architectural marvels that still stand today. The economy was booming. Art was flourishing. This was a civilization at its peak. And perhaps most importantly, the world was connected in a way it hadn't been since the Roman Empire. Thanks to the Mongol Empire's control of Asia, what historians call the Pax Mongolica, trade routes stretched from Italy all the way to China. A merchant in Venice could buy silk that had traveled 5,000 miles without ever leaving secure trade networks. Spices, gold, ideas, and technology flowed across continents with unprecedented speed. This was the medieval version of globalization. And just like today, that interconnectedness brought incredible prosperity. Markets were full, cities were growing, the future looked bright. But that same interconnectedness, those same trade routes that brought wealth and exotic goods, were about to become highways of death. The infrastructure for global catastrophe was perfectly in place. Nobody saw it coming. The story begins thousands of miles from Europe, in the vast steppes of Central Asia, probably somewhere in modern-day Kyrgyzstan or northern China. This is a harsh landscape of endless grassland, brutal winters, and scorching summers. And buried in the burrows of the marmots and ground squirrels that lived there was an ancient killer, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. For centuries, this bacterium existed in a delicate balance with its rodent hosts, living far from major human populations. It wasn't a problem, until suddenly it was. In the 1330s, something changed. Climate records suggest severe droughts followed by heavy rains devastated the steppes. The rodent population's food sources collapsed. Starving and desperate, infected rodents began migrating closer to human settlements, bringing their fleas with them. The first human victims were likely traders and workers at outposts along the Silk Road. They developed high fevers, violent vomiting, and the most terrifying symptom of all, massive, painful swellings in their lymph nodes, buboes, filled with blood and pus. These buboes, appearing under the arms and along the neck, gave the disease its name, Bubonic Plague. Most victims died within 3 to 7 days. Some died within hours. By the early 1340s, fragmented reports began reaching Mediterranean ports. Merchants spoke of entire civilizations in the East vanishing overnight, of cities in India, Mesopotamia, and Central Asia left completely empty. Europeans heard these stories with a mix of horror and detachment, terrible things happening in distant, exotic lands. Divine punishment for foreign beliefs, perhaps. They had no idea that the same ships bringing spices to flavor their food were carrying their executioner. The geographical turning point of this story is a city called Kaffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula jutting into the Black Sea. Kaffa was a fortified colony of the Republic of Genoa, incredibly wealthy, heavily defended, and absolutely crucial. It was the hinge connecting the overland Asian trade routes to the maritime networks of the Mediterranean. In 1346, Kaffa was under siege by the army of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Jani Beg. The Mongol army surrounded the city's massive stone walls, but the Genoese were masters of defense and could resupply by sea. The siege dragged on for months in a brutal stalemate. Then something unexpected happened. A silent killer began stalking the Mongol camps. Soldiers living in close quarters with poor sanitation became the perfect breeding ground for the plague that had traveled with them from the east. Men began dying by the hundreds, then thousands. Their bodies turned black with gangrene before death. The mighty Mongol army wasn't being defeated by enemy swords, it was dissolving from the inside out. Facing total defeat, Janibeg Beg made a decision that would echo through history. In an act of desperate biological warfare, he ordered the corpses of his plague-ridden soldiers loaded onto trebuchets, massive siege weapons. For days, the sky over Kaffa rained dead bodies. The Genoese defenders watched in absolute horror as pestilent corpses smashed onto rooftops and into market squares. The psychological terror was immense, but worse was the biological impact. The bacteria, carried in the fluids of the corpses and by the fleas abandoning their cold hosts for warm, living ones, infiltrated the city. The unbreakable fortress had been breached from within. Panic consumed Kaffa. The wealthy Genoese merchants did what wealthy people have always done in times of crisis. They fled. 12 Genoese galleys packed with refugees, cargo, and unseen stowaways slipped out of the harbor and sailed for home. They passed through the Bosphorus, past Constantinople, and into the open Mediterranean. Those 12 ships were floating time bombs, and they were heading straight for the heart of Europe. The first major European port to fall was Messina in Sicily, October 1347. When the Genoese galleys arrived, dockworkers rowed out to meet them. What they found was a scene from hell. Most of the sailors were dead, their bodies rotting on deck. The few survivors were delirious, covered in oozing black boils, coughing up blood. The port authorities immediately recognized something was terribly wrong. They ordered the ships expelled from the harbor, but it was already too late. The true agents of transmission, the black rats that lived on every medieval ship and the fleas on their backs, had already scurried down the mooring ropes onto the docks. Messina became the test case for how Europe would handle this crisis, and it failed spectacularly. The infection spread with terrifying speed. Medieval cities were perfect incubators, narrow winding streets, multi-story timber houses packed together blocking out the sun, open sewers running down the middle of roads, and thousands of people living in close quarters. Within weeks, the social fabric of Messina completely disintegrated. Families fled to the countryside, only spreading the contagion further across Sicily. From Messina, the plague jumped to other ports. Genoa, the home port of those original ships, was devastated. Venice, the magnificent queen of the Adriatic, faced an existential threat. The Venetians eventually pioneered the concept of quarantine, requiring ships to wait 40 days, 40 giorni, on isolated islands before entering the city. It was a revolutionary public health measure, but for the first wave, it was far too little too late. By early 1348, the disease had spread to Marseille, the gateway to France, and crossed to Dubrovnik. The entire coastal perimeter of Europe was breached. Now the plague turned inland, following river barges up the Rhone and trade carts along ancient Roman roads. It was heading for the great cities, Paris, Florence, Barcelona, London. Dense medieval metropolises that were architectural marvels but hygienic nightmares. When the plague hit these cities, it didn't just kill people. It killed the cities themselves as functioning organisms. We need to understand what it was like to face this enemy without modern science. The best doctors in Europe, the scholars at the University of Paris, were completely baffled. They didn't know about bacteria or germs. Their medical framework was based on ancient Greek theories of humors and miasma, the idea that corrupted air caused disease. The doctors blamed a specific alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 that supposedly released poisonous vapors from the Earth. Their treatments were worse than useless. They advised people not to bathe, believing it opened pores to corrupted air. They burned aromatic woods to combat the smell of death. They bled patients who were already dying. They lanced the buboes, which only spread the infection faster through the bloodstream. Every rational attempt to stop the disease only fed it. The realization that their best knowledge was completely useless created a profound psychological crisis. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the devastation of Florence, which lost perhaps 60% of its population. His accounts are absolutely chilling. He wrote that the terror of contagion was so great that the most sacred bonds of humanity were completely severed. Fathers abandoned their sons. Wives left husbands to die alone in their beds. The sick were walled up in their homes and left to rot. The entire machinery of civilization stopped functioning. Laws were ignored because there were no magistrates to enforce them. Courts closed. Bakeries stopped baking. Markets emptied. The sounds of a busy city, carts rattling, merchants shouting, construction, were replaced by heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the constant tolling of church bells for the dead, until the bell ringers themselves died or authorities banned the bells to prevent mass panic. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Consecrated churchyards filled completely, forcing authorities to dig massive plague pits, enormous trenches where bodies were stacked layer upon layer like cordwood, covered with just a thin dusting of soil. In medieval thinking, there was no separation between the physical and spiritual worlds. An event of this magnitude could only mean one thing: God was punishing humanity for its sins. People flooded into cathedrals, praying desperately for deliverance, massing together in religious processions. They didn't realize these gatherings were spreading the pneumonic form of the plague, the respiratory version even faster. When prayers failed and priests died just as quickly as sinners, a radical movement emerged, the flagellants. Bands of hundreds of men dressed in identical robes marched from town to town. Twice a day in public squares, they would strip to the waist and whip themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes, drawing blood in a public display of penance. They believed if they took the sins of the world onto their own flesh, they could appease God's wrath. But as the death toll mounted and God seemed not to listen, people needed a tangible enemy, a scapegoat. A horrific conspiracy theory took root across the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. Jewish communities were poisoning the wells to wipe out Christians. Despite Pope Clement VI officially condemning this theory and pointing out that Jews were dying of plague just as fast as Christians, mob mentality took over. Fueled by centuries of anti-Semitism and desperate rage, horrific pogroms erupted. Entire Jewish communities in Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne, and other cities were rounded up and burned alive in wooden buildings or town squares. The Black Death didn't just unleash biological horror. It unleashed the darkest aspects of human nature. While cities were the epicenters, 90% of medieval Europe's population actually lived in the countryside. And the plague reached them too. Refugees fleeing infected cities carried the disease to rural areas. Traveling peddlers unknowingly spread it from village to village. The devastation in the countryside was slower than in cities, but perhaps more profound in its long-term impact. Thousands of small villages, names now lost to history, were completely wiped out. You can still find evidence of these lost villages across Europe today, marked only by irregular patterns in fields or remnants of old foundations. Contemporary chronicles describe eerie scenes, harvests rotting in the fields with no one left alive to bring them in. Herds of sheep and cattle wandering aimlessly through the landscape, eventually turning feral or dying from neglect because all the shepherds were dead. Wolves, emboldened by the absence of humans, began encroaching on the remaining settlements. The carefully managed medieval agricultural landscape was being reclaimed by wilderness. The manorial system, which relied on peasant labor to work the Lord's land, ground to a complete halt. The entire economic and social structure of rural Europe collapsed. By 1350, the plague had reached the northern limits of the continent. Scotland, Scandinavia, even the small Norse settlements in Greenland, dealing them a death blow from which they never recovered. The plague had burned through the entire continent, from the warm Mediterranean to the frozen Arctic. By 1351, the initial catastrophic wave finally began to burn itself out. The bacterium had simply run out of easily accessible victims. When the fog lifted, survivors emerged into a world that looked the same but was fundamentally, irrevocably different. The exact death toll will never be known, but modern historians estimate between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia and North Africa. In Europe alone, roughly half the population, perhaps 50 million people, perished in less than 5 years. Think about that, half of everyone gone. The immediate aftermath was economic chaos, but then something remarkable happened. The massive depopulation created a severe labor shortage. For the first time in centuries, ordinary peasants held power. Lords desperate to have their land worked had to offer higher wages and better conditions. The rigid structures of serfdom, where peasants were essentially bound to the land like property, began to crack and eventually break in many places. Historians call it the golden age of the laborer, born from ashes and death. The psychological scars ran deep. Art became obsessed with death and mortality. The dance macabre, the dance of death, became a popular motif across Europe, showing skeletons dancing everyone from kings and popes to peasants to their graves. It was a stark reminder that death was the ultimate equalizer. No amount of wealth or power could save you. The optimism of the High Middle Ages was shattered. The unquestioning faith in the Church was damaged, planting seeds that would eventually grow into the Reformation. The social order was fundamentally questioned in ways that would eventually contribute to the Renaissance and beyond. The Black Death was the greatest trauma Western civilization ever endured. It proved the absolute fragility of human systems against the power of nature. The society that rebuilt itself was more cynical, more questioning, more adaptable, and forced to be. For centuries, the Black Death was treated as a distant medieval nightmare. Ancient history, something that could never happen again. But think about it. Empty streets, locked homes, overwhelmed hospitals, fear of the air itself, economic collapse, social bonds severed by fear of contagion. Does that really sound like ancient history? Or does it feel uncomfortably, unnervingly familiar? The plague was a test of civilization, a test of our systems, our science, our humanity. And tests have a way of repeating themselves. The question isn't whether another pandemic will come. The question is, have we learned anything? Are we ready, or will history repeat itself once more? I'm Tim, watching the past so we can understand the present. Together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.
Hi everyone, I am the owner of this channel. Please subscribe my channel for more interesting videos. I make real history videos. Please subscribe for more for videos. Thank you for watching. I like everyone.